Cheryl, David Eby has been greenlighting big energy projects in BC at a record pace. Why do you think he isn't on board with this pitch for a new oil pipeline?
Well, if you look at what he said that he's focused on real projects that have proponents. And in this case, it's Danielle Smith's idea. The premiers have agreed that the corridor would be great, but there's actually no proponent coming to the table saying, we'd like to build this project now. Are you on board? So what David Eby said is not, no, I don't support this project or this proponent. He's saying, listen, I've got lots on my plate right now, and I'm supportive of the things that actually have private sector investment and proponents that are going to push them ahead.
Yeah, but he did say he opposes the idea of lifting the tanker ban, which is a de facto no to the pipeline. So I'm staying with you for a second. I'm wondering, given that this is your party, do you think his opposition to this idea is more based on internal BC NDP politics rather than the merits of another pipeline to Tidewater?
I think it's very tough for any party in BC to just lean into build, baby, build. I think it's really important, whether you're a conservative politician or whether you're a progressive politician, to look at each project merit by merit, look at the environmental implications, look at the communities that surround it and what stands in the way of it being developed, and really lean into the things that have the most chance of success that communities around them support. And right now, for David Eby, that's not an oil pipeline to the North Coast. That is LNG. LNG exports off of terminals in British Columbia. And so it makes sense for him right now. I mean, in the best case scenario, he's avoiding this question. It makes sense for him right now to just lean into what really makes sense and what is most consequential to British Columbia's bottom line, which is LNG.
Yeah, I guess that's what I'm getting at, Sabrina. Eby, as Cheryl pointed out, isn't sounding super strident in his opposition to another oil pipeline, because he is pointing out, I'm not blocking one because nobody has come forward with a project to block. But I wonder if that leaves some daylight here. If a proponent could be found and did come forward, do you think Eby might get on board?
Well, I think in some ways it's like a chicken or the egg situation, right? So if Eby is putting up all of these roadblocks, well, maybe it's going to make it harder to find a proponent to put this project forward because they know that BC is already going to be against it from day one. I think to Cheryl's point about having, Eby wants to focus on BC specific economic revenue generators. I think it's not a mutually exclusive plan. Like you in this new one economy world where we're trying to build up domestic resilience or economic resilience across all sectors, all provinces, there's no reason why we wouldn't support more than one project, especially with a 2-year timeline that the Carney government wants to put on things. So I think that he's doing it because he doesn't think that he could get the support in BC, but I think the polling would tell him differently.
And just staying with my original premise of that question, if a proponent were to come forward, then do you think he might be more open to this idea?
I think he would have to be, because I think that if there's an actual project on the docket, the polling tells us that BC would be open to it. Like the people who live in BC are supportive of that. I think obviously we have to make sure that we do consult with Indigenous people and that we do have the First Nations sign off on these projects. But beyond that, I think that there's no reason why Eby would put up roadblocks when this is something that obviously the rest of the country is focused on.
And Smith says she is hoping to convince a proponent, maybe a consortium, she says, of private sector companies to come together around this idea. Cheryl, you were at Rachel Notley's side. I wonder if you're getting flashbacks when the NDP premier was pushing for the twinning of TMX while BC's then Liberal premier was opposed to it. What do you think Smith can learn from Notley's experience in maybe trying to convince David Eby to a yes?
Yeah, I think there's a lot to be learned from the way that Rachel campaigned for the Trans Mountain Pipeline. One is that when you're talking to a jurisdiction that doesn't speak the language of your industry and isn't immersed in it every day and doesn't owe, so much of its local economy to, not saying that BC doesn't, but a lot more in Alberta, you need to speak the language of the people you're trying to convince. And so some of that, like, Alberta deserves a pipeline, this is Canada's coast, we need this, like, it's important for Danielle Smith to go speak to people in British Columbia who she's trying to persuade on their terms and talk to them about the issues that they care about and talk to them about the facts around environmental protections and what happens in the case that, there is a spill or there is an environmental issue in BC. Talk to them about their concerns. And Rachel did this so well. She did a cross Canada campaign, coming to people, making sure that they understood that there's not a bridge, there's not a road, there's not a bike lane in this company that doesn't owe something to Alberta's energy industry. That's important for Danielle Smith to do too, just to make sure that people understand what's at stake if Canada chooses not to build these national infrastructure projects.
And while Notley was doing that, Christy Clark was issuing a list of demands for TMX to be built. Ottawa met almost all of them. Staying with you for a sec, Cheryl, could Smith use that precedent in trying to convince Eby, hey, ask something of Ottawa and maybe you shall receive?
Honestly, I think we're not even that far down the road. Like at this point, no one is calling for this pipeline except for Danielle Smith. Like I haven't heard anything from the private sector. We haven't seen a private proponent come forward. When we're in a world where there is private sector calling for this, when we're in a world where there's a proponent that wants to build this project, then let's start talking about what it means to get to a yes. But at this point, there's not even a real project on the table.
Okay, Sabrina, what about Ottawa in all of this? Mark Carney has also made the point that there isn't a proponent, but at the same time has also signaled that his government would get behind a new pipeline. What's your read on how Carney could play a factor in bringing a proponent to the table and getting a pipeline built?
Well, even more than Carney, I think Tim Hodgson, who's taken on this role, Minister of Natural Resources and Energy, is playing a really important role already. And I think you've seen his ability to negotiate with Alberta and come in and be open to some of the things that Alberta has to say about these things is miles and away beyond what we've seen in the last 2 years. And I think that he's setting the precedent that he's interested, but he's also approaching it from a business mindset. They're not going to support a project or, approve a pipeline that doesn't have an economic output to it and doesn't, I think, realistically have First Nations approval as well, or have First Nations buy-in, because that's something that we've heard from, maybe not at the First Minister's meeting, but we've heard from the government outside of that. So I think that there's definitely room to have Ottawa be a much bigger player and play a much more positive role with Alberta and BC than we've seen in the past. But I also think that other premiers will play a role, right? Like we've seen Francis Legault come on board with a pipeline project. We've seen Wab Kinew come on board with these ideas as well. So I think that it's important to say that this isn't just an Alberta-driven idea, that there is motivation across the country.
What about the sector playing a role quickly, Cheryl, as we wrap up? Carney has stressed that any barrels that flow through a new pipeline need to be decarbonized, as in oil sands producers need to get that Pathways carbon capture project underway. Do you read that as the Prime Minister saying if Pathways doesn't go ahead, he won't approve a new pipeline?
I think we've learned from history that it is much easier to make the case for additional natural resource infrastructure when there's another side of this. So in the example of Alberta and Rachel Notley, she convinced a lot of people by introducing a world leading for an energy producing jurisdiction environmental plan. And she paired that with expanding Trans Mountain to the coast. And so I think what the Prime Minister is trying to do here is say we can build more infrastructure, but it needs to be paired with significant investments in decarbonization. Right. And that's a much easier pill for other jurisdictions to swallow.
We'll have to leave it there. Excellent stuff, you two. Thank you.